Hello, welcome to this lesson. Today we're going to learn about converse, inverse, and contrapositive of a statement and determine their truth value. We'll also be able to talk about biconditional statements and write them using if and only if statements. For instance, by the end, if you see something about if a dog eats peanuts, then a horse will too. And then you'll be able to talk about its converse, inverse, and contrapositive. But before we do that, we have to learn some background vocabulary. We're going to be using logical statements, which consists of a set of premises and a conclusion. Now, we have to think, well, what are those things? Each given statement is a premise. So here our premise is if a dog eats peanuts. Now, the statement arrived through reasoning is called our conclusion. So this part over here will be our conclusion. All right. Now, once we have that, then we have to know what a conditional is, the converse, contrapositive, or inverse and contrapositive. Our conditional statement is just that first statement that we had. It's a compound statement formed by combining two statements, a hypothesis and a conclusion. And a hypothesis, it's something we also call a premise. And then we use the words if and then. If one thing is true, then we know something else is true. A converse is formed by switching our hypothesis and our conclusion around in the statement, but the if and then do not move. Now the inverse is formed by negating our hypothesis and negating our conclusion. And by negating, that's using the word not on both the statements. And our contrapositive is formed by negating both parts and interchanging the resulting negation. Now, I bet none of this makes any sense, and it probably shouldn't right now. Now, I'll try to explain it a little bit better. And first off, if we have an if-then statement or a conditional statement, we'll say if P, then Q. If I have P and Q be these two things, that's saying if I study, then I get good grades. So now we're taking this statement, we're turning it into a conditional statement. Our converse is going to flip around these two things. Our inverse is going to negate our first and last statement, and our converse or contrapositive is going to negate our converse, which starts to make a little bit more sense when you see these things. So I want you guys to write these statements in your guided notes like this. So a conditional statement, I want you to know if P then Q. A converse is going to be if Q then P. An inverse is if not P then not Q. And contrapositive, if not Q then not P. Now the word not, we can just write with this little symbol here. If you see that, it just means not. So this little thing will help you through the rest of the lesson. All right, my first statement is this. If two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. So first we have to figure out our P. If our P, then our Q. So now that is our conditional statement. If P, then Q. Our converse is if Q, then P. But before we start writing, we have to think about what this means. If we say if they are congruent, we don't really know what they is referring to. So what I'm going to write is, I'm going to actually type on this one so you can read it a little bit better. But I'm going to say if two angles, because they refers to two angles, and then I finish the rest of Q. If they are congruent, then, and now we finish the rest of P. They are, I should make this smaller so I can fit it in the blocks, vertical angles. Now, for my inverse, I'm going to do the same thing. But now it says if not P. So if we're not going to have P, so if two angles are not vertical angles, if two angles are not vertical angles, then not Q, so they are not congruent. Hopefully this is starting to make a little bit of sense. Our contrapositive, if not Q, so if not the second part. So pretty much the contrapositive negates our converse. So if two angles are not congruent, then they are not vertical angles. All right. So now we have all the statements. Now we have to determine if they're true or false. So our first statement, if they are vertical angles, I'll create two vertical angles. I'll call them 1 and 2. If those are vertical, do they have to be congruent? Hopefully you remember from last chapter that that is a true statement. They have to be congruent. Now, if you know any two angles are congruent, looking at my converse, do they have to be vertical angles? If I have this angle that's 50 and this angle over here that's 50, are those vertical angles? Hopefully you're saying no. That's a false statement. Now, if two angles are not vertical angles, say these two are not vertical angles, then they are not congruent. That's not true because of the same counterexample. So we can say false. Our last statement, if two angles are not congruent, any two angles that are not congruent, let's say 30 and 50, then they are not vertical angles. That's true. They can't, if they're not congruent, then they can't be vertical angles. So that's a true statement. So notice that the original and the contrapositive are true, and the other two are false. Now I want you guys to take a minute and see if you can do this on your own. Once you're done, pause the video and see how well you've done. Hopefully you're done with the problem. And here is the answer. For a converse, we switch the P and the Q around. So you would say if it is not if an object is a flower, then it is a rose. For the inverse, if an object is not a rose, then it is not a flower. And for the contrapositive, if it's not a flower, then it is not a rose. So in this case, if it's a rose, then it's a flower. That is true because all roses are flowers. If an object is a flower, then it is a rose. No, because there are things that are flowers that are not roses. And if it is not a rose, then it is not a flower. The same reasoning is converse. And then if it is not a flower, then it is not a rose. So if something isn't a flower, then it's not going to be a rose. That's true. All right, I want you to try one more on your own. Pause the video and see if you can do this one on your own and check your answer. All right, hopefully you finished. And now we have if a triangle's base angles are not congruent, then the triangle is, or if the triangle's base angles are congruent, then the triangle is isosceles. The inverse is if the triangle is not isosceles, then the triangle's base angles are not congruent. And the last one is if the triangle's base angles are not congruent, then the triangle is not isosceles. Now, there's something that we need to know about geometry in this one. And if these two angles are congruent at 70, these two sides that are opposite are also going to be the same measure. So this original statement is true. Also, this converse is also true. If the base angles are congruent, then we know these sides are congruent. And the inverse is true. If it's not isosceles, then those are not congruent. And the contrapositive is also true. So this is a case where they're all true. Now, which sides are always true if the original statement's true? Hopefully you're looking at the contrapositive. The contrapositive was always true if the conditional statement is true. That's our law of contrapositives. Now, if all of the statements are true, like our last one, we call that a biconditional statement. It's a statement that combines our original statement and its converse. Uh, and we usually use that if both of them are true. An example, when we combine those statements, we use this weird thing that's called if and only if. If you see that in the middle of a sentence, it means two things. One, if I have Dave works on his homework if and only if a teacher is close to him, it means if Dave does his homework, then the teacher is close to him. And it also means if a teacher is close to him, then Dave does his homework. This one statement is two different if-then statements. Let's try one. So what does it mean if I said, I brush my teeth if and only if I'm done eating? Well, first off, what it means is if I am done eating, then, or sorry, if I brush my teeth, then I finished eating my breakfast. And it also means if I finished eating my breakfast, then I brush my teeth. So that one statement with an if and only if means both of these statements. All right, hopefully that starts to make a little sense and you're ready to come to class.